$72 million. Thrown away into thin air. The American Navy built two of the most expensive cruisers of the Second World War, and they did absolutely nothing. 0 victories, 0 ships sunk, 3 planes shot down between the two of them, and then off to the scrap heap. Today's hero is the battlecruiser Alaska, but here's what no one says out loud. This wasn't an accident. It was a system. It was lobbying. It was people who knew the truth and stayed silent. I pulled the documents. I analyzed every decision. And what I found is not just a story about a failed ship. It is a story about how big money kills common sense. I recommend watching until the end. The finale of this story will surprise you. Pacific Ocean, March 18th, 1945. A gray morning. The smell of salt and fuel oil. The horizon is shrouded in haze. And somewhere in that haze, Japanese planes. The anti-aircraft guns opened fire. All the deck anti-aircraft weaponry of the two huge ships, hundreds of barrels, pounding the sky. The roar was so loud that people on the bridge couldn't hear their own commands. Shell casings rolled across the deck by the hundreds. Then, silence. The smoke dissipated. 3 planes fell into the water. 1 ship shot down 2, the other shot down 1. 3 planes, for the whole day, for the entire operation. That's it. Now, stop for a second and imagine one fact. Each of the 2 ships that participated in this battle cost approximately $72 million at the time of construction. In 1944 prices, these were some of the most expensive combat ships the American Navy had ever built. $72 million. 9 12-inch guns on each. A crew of over 2,000 people. Length, almost 250 meters. Speed, 33 knots. And the result of their participation in the war? 3 planes between them. This isn't a defeat in battle. It's something worse. It's complete irrelevance. These 2 ships were named Alaska and Guam. The American Navy classified them as a special class, large cruisers. They were supposed to be hunters, fast, powerful, merciless. They were supposed to destroy Japanese heavy cruisers before they could strike at the aircraft carriers. They were supposed to. But something went wrong. More accurately, everything went wrong. From the very beginning. From the first blueprint. From the first meeting in First Blueprint. From the first meeting in Washington. And 3 years after the end of the war, in February 1947, both ships were taken out of active service. After only 3 years of duty. And in the early 1960s, they were cut up for scrap metal. $72 million. 3 years. 3 planes. How is that even possible? Today we will take this story apart piece by piece. We will travel the whole path, from the offices of Washington to the shipyard in New Jersey, from the Pacific Ocean to the Yellow Sea. We will analyze every decision, every miscalculation, every moment when someone had a chance to stop, and no one did. And at the end, you will have the answer to the question I will ask right now. Were these ships a mistake from the start, or a victim of circumstances that no one could have predicted? But to understand this answer, we need to go back. To understand how the Alaska appeared, you need to understand one simple thing. The American Navy in the 1930s lived in constant fear. Not of war in general, but of a specific ship. Or rather, of a whole class of ships. Japanese heavy cruisers. Let's figure out what they were and why they were so frightening. After the First World War, the major naval powers sat down at the negotiating table. No one wanted a new arms race. Too expensive. Too dangerous. In February 1922, a treaty was signed in Washington that was supposed to organize everything. It was called the Washington Naval Treaty. The treaty set the rules of the game. A cruiser, a combat ship of medium size, fast and versatile, could not weigh more than 10,000 tons, and could not carry guns larger than 8 inches. 8 inches is 203 millimeters. To understand, the shell of such a gun weighs about 120 kilograms, about the weight of an adult motorcycle. Everyone signed, everyone agreed, and everyone started looking for ways to bypass the treaty. The Japanese proved to be particularly good at this art. Their Takao-class cruisers, 4 ships built in the early 1930s, officially fit within the treaty limits, on paper. On the water, they weighed significantly more than stated. They carried 10 8-inch guns. They were fast, well protected, and very dangerous. American specialists studied their characteristics and came to an unpleasant conclusion. In open combat, American cruisers would lose. And now imagine the task of an American admiral. An aircraft carrier is the heart of the fleet. Without it, there is no reconnaissance, no air cover, no strike power at a distance. The aircraft carrier must be protected from submarines, from planes, from surface ships. And now, one Japanese heavy cruiser breaks through to your carrier strike group. Your cruisers won't stop it. They lack the armor or the guns to do so. What to do? In December 1934, Japan officially notified other countries that it was withdrawing from the treaty system. From December 31, 1936, the Washington Naval Treaty ceased to exist for Japan. Japanese designers gained complete freedom, and they took advantage of it. The threat was becoming real. The Pacific Ocean is huge. Distances there are such that ships don't see the shore for weeks. Japan was building a fleet for war exactly there, and the American Navy understood this. They needed an answer, a concrete one, a steel one. The idea was born in the late 1930s. They needed a ship that could catch any Japanese heavy cruiser and destroy it before it could strike. A ship faster than a battleship, stronger than a cruiser, a hunter, specially tailored for one task. In the American Navy, they came up with a separate class for such ships, not a cruiser and not a battleship, something in between. They called it a large cruiser. It sounds convincing, logical, necessary. But here is what is interesting. While some admirals feared Japanese cruisers, others feared something else entirely. They feared the large cruiser project itself. And they had very concrete reasons for it. Within the American Navy, there was a war going on. A war over whether this ship should be built at all. And it was much dirtier than any naval battle. Imagine a meeting. Washington, late 1930s. A long table, maps of the Pacific Ocean on the wall, people in uniform and people in suits. And one question on the agenda. Does the American Navy need this ship? The room was divided. On one side, supporters. Their main argument was simple and understandable. The aircraft carrier is the most valuable ship in the fleet. Its loss could decide the outcome of an entire campaign. And the Japanese have heavy cruisers that could reach it. Therefore, a ship is needed to intercept them first. Fast, powerful, specifically for this task. The main proponent of the project in Naval Command was Admiral Ernest King, a tough, straightforward, and very influential man. He saw the future large cruiser as an irreplaceable element of the protection of carrier strike groups. His position was clear. We need this ship. Period. On the other side of the table sat the opponents, and their arguments were also concrete. First, the price. The design ship cost approached that of a battleship, and a battleship is a whole different level of combat power. So why pay the same for a weaker ship? Second, the task. There were already regular cruisers and destroyers for the protection of aircraft carriers. Why build something new and expensive if you can get by with what you already have? Third, the class. This ship is not a battleship because its armor is weaker, and it's not a cruiser because it is significantly larger and more expensive. It is an unknown thing, and unknown things in military planning are always a risk. The discussion went on for a long time. The project was redesigned several times. They looked for a balance between price, speed, armament, and protection. It was never found, because the task inherently contained a contradiction. But more on that later. As a result, the American Navy approved a separate class for such ships with the designation CB, large cruiser. Not a battleship, not a cruiser. Something of its own, intermediate. The plans were sweeping. A series of 6 ships: Alaska, Guam, Hawaii, Philippines, Puerto Rico, Samoa. Note the names. In the American Navy, battleships were named after states, cruisers after cities, And these ships were named after territories that depended on the United States, but were not states. Alaska in those years was just such a territory. It became a state only in 1959. This is not an accident. It was a signal. These are our interests in the Pacific. This is what we are protecting. But the discussion within the Navy did not subside. And then a man stepped in whose word ended any discussion. President Franklin Roosevelt personally supported the project. After that, the disputes stopped. Officially. Unofficially, one of the admirals opened his personal diary that same evening and wrote a few words. Short. Bitter. We will return to them towards the end, because then they will sound completely different. The decision was made. The money was allocated. The blueprints were approved. And the engineers got to work. So, the decision was made. The money was allocated. The blueprints were approved. What exactly was built? Let's walk through this ship. Not as engineers, as people who want to understand what $72 million was actually spent on. The length of the Alaska is 247 meters, about 2.5 football fields lined up in a row. Width, 27.5 meters. Displacement, that is, the mass of water the ship displaces when at sea, which is effectively equal to the mass of the ship itself, was about 34,000 tons in combat trim. This is a huge machine. Serious, impressive. Now, the main thing. The reason everything was built. The guns. The Alaska carried 9 12-inch guns. 12 inches is 305 millimeters. 3 guns in each of the 3 turrets. 1 turret in the bow, 1 in the stern, 1 in between. What does 305 millimeters mean? It means that the shell of such a gun weighs 517 kilograms. Imagine a passenger car, a small city car. That's roughly how much it weighs. And this machine flies at a speed of 762 meters per second, twice the speed of sound, and hits a target at a distance of up to 35 kilometers. 35 kilometers is from London to Heathrow Airport and back. At a distance of 9 kilometers, an armor-piercing shell penetrated armor plating 46 centimeters thick, almost half a meter of steel, straight through. Rate of fire, 3 shots per minute per barrel. 9 barrels. Imagine that sound. Impressive? Absolutely. But now let's look at the other side. The one they talk about quietly and quickly in presentations. The armor. 17% of the ship's total mass went into the Alaska's armor protection. 17. It sounds like a digit, but let's translate it into an image. The battleship North Carolina, an American battleship of the same period, carried armor that accounted for 40% of its mass, almost twice as much. The difference between 17 and 40% is the difference between a hunter and a fighter. The Alaska was fast, but it was fragile. Relative to its size and price, very fragile. Now, maneuverability. And here is where something quite unexpected begins. The Alaska had 1 keel and 1 rudder. For a ship of this size, a controversial decision. And here is the result. To turn at full speed of 30 knots, the Alaska needed to describe a circle with a diameter of about 840 meters, almost a kilometer. For comparison, the battleship Iowa, a ship almost twice as heavy as the Alaska and noticeably longer. So, the Iowa turned in a smaller radius. The huge, heavy battleship was more maneuverable than the large cruiser that was built, among other things, for speed and agility. This was a record for poor maneuverability for the entire American fleet of that time. On the other hand, one design decision on the Alaska was truly smart. The engineers remembered the Battle of Jutland, May 1916, North Sea. Back then, British battle cruisers exploded one after another. Fire from damaged turrets penetrated the powder magazines. The result, the instantaneous death of the ship and almost the entire crew. On the Alaska, this problem was solved. The ammunition supply system to the guns consisted of two stages. The charges first went from the magazine to an intermediate compartment, and only from there to the gun. Each transition was equipped with fireproof materials and special locking mechanisms that prevented more than one hatch from being opened at a time in the supply chain. Flame from the turret physically could not reach the powder magazine. This is a correct decision. This is good engineering. But here is the question that some officers studying the project ask themselves. What happens if a torpedo hits below the armored belt, where there is almost no protection? The answer to this question was formulated cautiously in official documents. Very cautiously. But while the steel was cooling at the shipyard, the world outside was changing. December 17th, 1941, Camden, New Jersey. The New York Shipbuilding Company shipyard. Workers started cutting steel for the first ship of the series. The Alaska was officially laid down. Remember this date, December 17th, 1941, because 10 days before that, something important happened. December 7th, 1941, Japanese aviation attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered the war. And in this atmosphere of shock, anger, and urgent mobilization, the Alaska was laid down on the slipway, the killer of Japanese cruisers, which they had wanted to build for so long. On February 2nd, 1942, the second ship of the series, Guam, was laid down at the same shipyard. Construction continued. The shipyard was working. Thousands of workers came to their shift every day, cutting and welding steel, installing mechanisms, laying cables. Huge hulls slowly grew on the slipways. And at that time, something was happening in the Pacific Ocean that the workers at the shipyard in Camden might not have thought about. Or they thought about it, but didn't understand what exactly it meant for the ships they were building. On June 4th, 1942, off the Midway atoll, American aviation attacked the Japanese fleet. During the 3 days of the battle, Japan lost 4 heavy aircraft carriers. 4 in one battle. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. The pride of Japanese naval aviation. It was a turning point in the war in the Pacific. But for our story, something else is important. After Midway, the Japanese fleet began to lose not only aircraft carriers. Battles near Guadalcanal began, and there the Japanese lost dozens of ships. Cruisers, destroyers, transports. Exactly those they were building the Alaska to fight. In Washington, they noticed this. The picture was changing. In June 1943, plans to lay down the 3 remaining ships of the series, Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Samoa, were canceled. The official reason? A change in the military situation. Simply put, there were fewer and fewer of those enemies these ships were meant to destroy. On August 15, 1943, the Alaska was launched. The huge hull slid off the slipway and entered the water in Camden. A beautiful sight, impressive. At the same time, August 1943, fierce battles were raging in the Pacific near the Solomon Islands. The Japanese fleet was suffering losses, again and again. On November 12, 1943, the Guam was launched. On June 17, 1944, the Alaska was officially commissioned. It received a crew, hoisted the flag. It became a combat ship. By this moment, the Battle of Midway had been 2 years ago. The Guadalcanal campaign had ended a year and a half ago. The Japanese fleet was already nothing like it was in 1941. On September 17, 1944, the Guam entered service. Both ships were ready. Both were magnificent. Both were built exactly as intended. Powerful armament, high speed, excellent magazine protection system. And one question that hung in the air over Washington and over the ships themselves. What to do with them now? The ship is finished. The crew is recruited. The flag is hoisted. The Alaska is going to war. All that remains is to find someone to fight. So, 2 ships are in service. Crews are trained. Guns are tested. Mechanisms are tuned. Until the beginning of 1945, Alaska and Guam were engaged in combat training, practice maneuvers, fired at targets, learned to act as part of a formation.
everything went according to plan. And then they were finally included in a large task force, Task Force 58. This was the most powerful carrier association of the American Navy in the Pacific.
Several aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers. A huge force. It was here that Alaska and Guam were finally to show why they were built. The first operations, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Two names known to everyone interested in the history of the Second World War. Two bloody battles that cost the American Navy and Marine Corps huge losses. What were Alaska and Guam doing there? Guarding aircraft carriers, sailing in formation, holding position. Exactly what Admiral King intended for them. Escort, cover, protection of the fleet's main strike force. In this role, they managed. No one broke through to the aircraft carriers past them. But Japanese heavy cruisers, the very ones everything was intended for, did not appear on the horizon. March 18, 1945, was the moment that entered the combat history of these ships. Japanese planes attacked the formation. The anti-aircraft gunners of Alaska and Guam opened fire. When it was over, 2 planes credited to the Alaska, 1 to the Guam. 3 machines, 3 shot-down planes. This is the only direct combat result of both ships for the entire war. This is not the opinion of critics. This is official history. Think about this number. 2 ships. Total cost, $144 million. Total crew, over 4,000 people. 26 12-inch guns between the 2 ships, not counting the anti-aircraft armament. 3 planes. In July 1945, both ships received a new task: to act against Japanese shipping in the Yellow Sea. Sounds significant. The Yellow Sea, this is a strategically important area. Japanese transports, supplies, communications. The commander of the Alaska looked at the horizon. The horizon was empty. Japanese shipping in the Yellow Sea at that moment practically did not exist. It had been destroyed earlier. American submarines and aviation had been working there methodically for several years. There was no one to hunt. By the end of the war, the cruiser Alaska received 2 battle stars. The cruiser Guam, also 2 battle stars. Battle stars are official awards for participation in combat operations. They are given for presence in combat zones, for carrying out tasks, for service, not for victories over the enemy, for service. And this is perhaps the most honest characterization of the entire combat career of these ships. They served. They were present. They guarded. They carried out orders. But the enemy, that specific enemy for which they were built, they never found. The war was ending, and with it, the only reason for the existence of these ships was ending. August 1945. The war ended. Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The Pacific Ocean fell silent. The fleet began to return home. Alaska and Guam joined the 7th Fleet of the United States. The 7th Fleet is the American naval presence in the western part of the Pacific Ocean. A large structure. Serious. And here, something happened that at first glance looks like an honor. Guam became the flagship of Cruiser Division 95. A flagship is a ship on which the commander of the formation flies their flag. It is prestigious. It is a visible position. Alongside the Guam in the same formation sailed its sister ship, the identical ship, Alaska. 2 huge, beautiful ships. Flagship and its closest peer. Everything looks decent. But let's look at it differently. A flagship is primarily a floating headquarters, a place where the command is located, communications personnel work, meetings are held. The combat value of a flagship in peacetime is determined not by guns, but by comfort and presentation. Guam, with its huge size and spacious rooms, was well suited for this role. Not because it was indispensable as a combat unit, but because it was large and convenient. This is not an honor. This is a polite way to occupy an expensive ship with something useful. Meanwhile, in Washington, there were talks about what to do with both ships next. Several proposals were laid on the table. First, to convert Alaska and Guam into missile cruisers. After the war, missile weapons were developing rapidly, and the Navy was actively looking for ways to modernize old hulls for new tasks. Some ships went through such a conversion successfully, but Alaska and Guam? No. The cost of the conversion was recognized as too high, and the result? Not interesting enough. The second proposal, to convert one of the ships into a command ship, a special vessel for coordinating large operations with enhanced communications and staff quarters. Again, an interesting idea on paper. Again, too expensive. Again, impractical. Imagine this moment. A ship on which $72 million was spent, which was built for several years, which went to war and did not find its enemy. And now, specialists look at it and say, we won't convert it either. Expensive, impractical. On February 17, 1947, both cruisers, Alaska and Guam, were officially excluded from the active service of the United States Navy. From the laying of the Alaska to this moment, a little over 5 years had passed. From commission, less than 3. 3 years of service. For comparison, the battleship Iowa, laid down around the same time, remained in the fleet until 1990. 46 years. 3 years versus 46. After being excluded from active service, both cruisers were transferred to the reserve. They stood at the dock. Huge. Quiet. Waiting for a decision that no one was in a hurry to make. The decision was eventually made. Simple. Final. They were sent where everything unnecessary is sent. In the early 1960s, workers with cutters came for the Alaska and Guam. Not enemies. Not war. Ordinary workers in work clothes with metal cutting equipment. They did their work calmly and methodically. Just as calmly and methodically as other workers, 15 years ago, welded and cut steel at the shipyard in Camden, assembling these very ships. The circle closed. 247 meters of steel. Turrets with 12-inch guns. Armor plates. Mechanisms. All this was slowly taken apart. Parts were loaded and taken away. The metal went to be melted down. No ceremonial event. No farewell speeches. Just work. Let's stop for a second and think about this. These ships stood in reserve for over 10 years. From 1947, when they were pulled from active service, until the early 1960s, when they were finally dismantled. More than 10 years they stood at the pier. Huge. Quiet. Unnecessary. Imagine this image. 247 meters of gray metal. Empty decks. Sealed hatches. Guns that will never fire again. The horizon ahead, just as empty as back then, in the Yellow Sea in July 1945. The horizon was always empty, from the very beginning. Now, a comparison that explains a lot. The battleship Iowa, laid down in April 1940, commissioned in February 1943, about the same period as the Alaska. Served during the Second World War, then in the Korean War, then was again pulled into reserve, then returned to service in 1984, already with cruise missiles and modern equipment. Finally removed from the fleet in 1990. Today, the Iowa stands in Los Angeles as a museum ship. You can visit it, get on board, stand by the gun turret. Alaska and Guam, scrap metal. Why such a difference in fates? Because the Iowa was a truly versatile combat ship. It could fight in different wars, with different enemies, in different conditions. It could be modernized, and was. It was needed again and again. Alaska was honed for one task: kill Japanese heavy cruisers. When this task disappeared, the meaning of the ship disappeared. Modernizing it was too expensive. Converting it was impractical. Keeping it as a museum. Apparently, it didn't occur to anyone, or no one was found willing to take on the expenses. What is left of the Alaska and Guam today? Archive photographs, models in private collections, lines in naval reference books, a few pages in books on the history of the American Navy, and videos like this, where we try to figure out how such a thing could even be possible. 2 ships, $144 million, 3 years of service, 3 shot-down planes, and cutters in the early 1960s. But the question remained. So, before us are the facts. 2 ships, built, commissioned, served for 3 years, cut up for scrap. Combat result, 3 shot-down planes between the 2. Now the main question, the one I asked at the very beginning. Was this a mistake from the beginning, or a victim of circumstances? Let's analyze it honestly, like a court. First, the defense, then the prosecution. The defense of the project looks like this. In the late 1930s, the threat of Japanese heavy cruisers was real. Not imagined, not exaggerated, real. The Japanese fleet was indeed building powerful ships that outperformed American cruisers. Aircraft carriers indeed needed protection. The task was formulated correctly. Besides that, no one in 1940 could predict exactly how quickly the war in the Pacific would develop. No one knew that the Battle of Midway in June 1942 would turn the tide of the war so sharply and so quickly. No one could guarantee that the Japanese fleet would be destroyed before the Alaska entered service. Military planning always works with uncertainty. Ships are built for years. Threats change faster than hulls on slipways. This is a systemic problem, not anyone's personal fault. The defense has finished. The prosecution takes the floor. And here, the most interesting part begins. The problem of the Alaska was not only that the enemy disappeared ahead of time. The problem was in the very concept of the ship, in that contradiction which they built into it from the very beginning and never managed to resolve. Remember the numbers. Armor, 17% of the ship's mass. The battleship North Carolina, 40%. The Alaska was vulnerable to torpedoes. A hit below the armored belt could be fatal. It was vulnerable to battleships at any distance. It is scary to imagine what would have happened if it had met a Japanese submarine or Japanese battle cruisers of the Congo type. It was too big and expensive to be used as a regular cruiser, and too weak and vulnerable to operate alongside battleships. It got stuck in the middle, between 2 classes of ships, and it didn't really belong to either of them. Russian naval historian Vladimir Kaufman, one of the leading specialists in Second World War combat ships, gave this project a harsh assessment. According to him, the Alaska-class battlecruisers were, I quote, the most useless of the large ships built during the Second World War. The most useless. Not the most unsuccessful for technical reasons. Not the most expensive. Specifically, useless. This is a harsh verdict, but it is accurate. And now, I promise to return to one thing. Remember the section where we talked about how Roosevelt personally supported the project and shut down the discussion? I mentioned that one of the admirals wrote a few short words in his diary that evening. So, this image is collective. History has not preserved for us diaries with concrete words about the Alaska, but it has preserved something more weighty. It has preserved the minutes of meetings in which several high-ranking officers of the American Navy openly called the project expensive and useless, even before the first sheet of steel was cut at the shipyard. They said it out loud, in official documents, and they were not heard. Because on the other side of the scale stood Roosevelt and Admiral King. And this is not a technical miscalculation. This is something else. This is the moment when political weight is more important than engineering logic. When the right person in the right chair can end any dispute, simply because they are in the right chair. This has happened before. This is happening now. This will always happen as long as there is big money and big ambitions. But this story has something that goes beyond one ship. Let's for a second divert our attention from Alaska and Guam. Let's talk about the idea itself, about what stands behind this story. Every few years, in different countries, in different eras, approximately the same thing happens. A military department or a large corporation defines a threat. The The threat is real, concrete, documented. An answer is developed for this threat. Expensive, large-scale, impressive. Production starts. Money is spent. Years of work. And then, the threat changes. Or disappears. Or it turns out that the answer was chosen incorrectly. And then it turns out that what was built is beautiful, expensive, and unnecessary. Alaska is the ideal example of this mechanism. Not because stupid people worked there. Smart people worked there. Experienced admirals, talented engineers, professional military planners. Some of them directly said, "Something is wrong here." They were not heard. Why? Because the project had influential patrons. Because money had already started being spent. Because admitting a mistake halfway through is politically painful. Because there is always hope. Maybe everything will turn out differently. Maybe the enemy will not go anywhere. Maybe the ship will find its application. It didn't find it. This is what is important to understand about Alaska. It was not a failure due to incompetence. It was a failure due to a system in which a political impulse once launched is very difficult to stop. Even when smart people inside this system see the problem. This is a lesson that costs dearly. $144 million in 1944 prices. If you convert to today's money, taking inflation into account, it is more than $2 billion. $2 billion for 3 years of service and 3 shot-down planes. Now let's go back to where we started. March 18th, 1945. Pacific Ocean. Gray morning. The smell of salt and fuel oil. The anti-aircraft guns went silent. 3 planes fell into the water. The smoke dissipated. The commander of the Alaska stood on the bridge and looked at the horizon. The horizon was empty. The Japanese heavy cruisers were not there. They were not there in March 1945. They were not there in July 1945 in the Yellow Sea. They disappeared before the Alaska managed to go on the hunt. And in this empty horizon is the whole history of these ships. Built for an enemy they did not catch. Beautiful, powerful, expensive, and deeply, fundamentally uncalled for. Alaska and Guam went to the scrap heap in the early 1960s. Quietly, without ceremonies, without farewell speeches. But there is one thing that the scrap metal does not take. Questions. How many such projects existed before the Alaska? How many exist now, in other countries, in other industries, with other names and other budgets, but with the same logic inside? Expensive, large scale, under a specific threat, with influential patrons, with voices of dissent that are not heard. I don't know the answer to this question, but I know that the story of the Alaska is not just the story of one ship. It is a story about how big decisions are made, and about the price that everyone pays when these decisions are made incorrectly. 2 ships, $144 million, 3 years, 3 planes, and an empty horizon. Thank you for being with us until the end. If you are interested in the history of the Navy, subscribe. There are many more stories ahead. Some of them ended better, some much worse. See ya.